But these days, there's so many outlets and there's so much coverage. And not only that, you get asked about it every day today. Back then, nobody really ever asked you anything about what was happening socially. You had to seek someone out and bring it up yourself.
Now, one of the blessings of the pandemic is that we got to see The Last Dance earlier than was originally scheduled. The complete manifesto of everything Michael Jordan, your former teammate. And of course, you told the story, Steve, of what happened in practice between you and Michael Jordan, and how you, unfortunately, your face suffered a little bit of a calamity dealing with Jordan. Was it, I don't know if you got this sense through social media or maybe even through conversation, but what was amazing to me is I forget that I saw it in real time. You saw it in real time, but there's a whole generation of Black basketball fans who did not see Michael Jordan in real time. So for them, it was like a real education. Was it startling to you that The Last Dance, people had to be reminded of how good Michael Jordan was?
Yeah. Or maybe we had to be reminded how old we are. You know?
Right.
It's one of those two things. I think the way I think about it is, now that I'm 54, when you and I were growing up, and I think I'm older than you, so please don't take offense to that comment. But, when you and I were growing up, we heard names that we probably didn't see, but we recognized, right? Whether it was, Willie Mays, I'm a big baseball fan. I used to read about Willie Mays. I never really saw Willie Mays play. I just knew he was phenomenal, Babe Ruth is obvious. Everybody knows Babe Ruth, but we didn't see Babe Ruth play. And so I think what I realized watching The Last Dance with, hearing all these stories from our players or my own kids even, is that's just, Michael is the modern version of Willie Mays was to me, or even Babe Ruth. It's just, they know the name, they know, he's possibly the greatest of all time, but they never really saw him play up close and personal. And so that was my favorite thing about the documentary, is that it reminded everybody just how dominant he was.
There were some of your former teammates who seemed to take issue with how they were portrayed in the series. What did you think about how you were portrayed in it?
I thought I was, frankly, portrayed a little too much, a little too often. It was, it's interesting because you make a documentary like that, you even though it was 10 hours of coverage, they could have gone on and done 50 hours probably. But I know a lot of us felt like Ron Harper and Luke Longley should have been mentioned. They were starters on that team, and actually starters on all three championship teams. And we really didn't get much reference to them. And so it was a little bit embarrassing that I was on there so often, but I understand the filmmakers had to focus on what they wanted and who was accessible. Luke's buried somewhere down in western remote Australia, and so there were some things that I would have liked to have seen, but all in all, I mean, they captured that era really well. And I think all of us were a little disappointed in the depiction of Scottie Pippen. A couple of times, they showed him miss a couple of big free throws. We all missed big free throws. I don't know why they had to show that on the documentary. It just seemed like there were a couple shots at him that were unnecessary, that maybe were just used to kind of provide some edge and a little more texture to what was happening back then with his relationship, with the management and with Michael. And Scottie was everybody's favorite player on that team. Everybody loves Scottie Pippen, one of the most amazing players and teammates I've ever had. So, but I'm rambling now. So I thought all in all, they did a great job with it.
I was here for Ron Harper. I would maybe throwing Craig Elo under the bus is a little dramatic, but when he talked about how he didn't wind up on Michael Jordan, that was one of my favorite parts when Jordan hit, of course, that big shot
Yeah.
over Cleveland. Was there anything that you learned about Michael Jordan in The Last Dance that you didn't know?
Well, I never anticipated that he would get emotional, um, and that was moving. You know, and it was something that he rarely, if ever, showed back then. You know, and I think part of his um, presence back then was never showing weakness, and that was clearly demonstrated in the telling of the story. But in the retelling of the story, he gets emotional several times, and I was moved by that.
Of course, you know, when you played, you know, especially because Michael Jordan kind of, you know, he was a guy who was a global icon. I took a lot of criticism for how he didn't speak up. And I think a lot of athletes during that time, you know, were focused on kind of the blueprint that he had in terms of marketability and kind of being a little on the fence so that you didn't, you know, kind of piss anybody off. Obviously today we're in a different time. Have you thought about, if you were playing now, how you might have personally decided to respond to everything happening in our country?
Me personally, or Mike?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You, how do you think in today's time, if you were still playing,
yeah,
you might have responded to everything, all the unrest, these racial conversations we're having now in our country?
yeah. I mean, I feel like I would have been pretty vocal about things. Yeah, you're right, though. At the time, it wasn't very common, and to be honest, the times maybe didn't call for it as much. I mean, obviously there were still some horrible things happening, but I think we were in a much more calm period in our nation's history. Um, and so as a result, there seemed to be a calmer tone everywhere, and athletes, for the most part, kind of stayed out of things. Now, that wasn't true in the late 60s, you know, in the civil rights era, when Muhammad Ali and Jim Brown and a lot of black athletes were really vocal. But in the 90s, 80s and 90s, it seemed like there was kind of a lull in that area. But these days, there's so many outlets and there's so much coverage. And not only that, you get asked about it every day today. Back then, nobody really ever asked you anything about what was happening socially. You had to seek someone out and bring it up yourself.
Um, when you, you know, look at like all the conversations we're having right now, we're very close to an election. You have chosen to be extremely outspoken about how you feel about not just what's happening in our nation, but about this presidential administration. So much so that Donald Trump knows you by name. Um, how did that make you feel to be singled out and criticized by the president?
It was really strange. It was very weird, and I know you know the feeling. 'Cause you were called out by him too. It felt so kind of slimy. You know, it's like, really, like we don't have anything bigger on the agenda today. You know, and but I was also kind of ashamed because his comments came on the heels of the discussion about China after Daryl Morey's comments. And it was probably the one time in my career where I was very unsure about what I should say. And I didn't feel pressured by anybody, but I felt sort of cornered by my own circumstances in terms of how I should respond. And my response was terrible. And so in some ways I deserve the criticism that I got, but not really from the president, because, you know, there was, especially on the China issue, because we can go into all kinds of detail about how, you know, his relationship with the Chinese government and the trade agreement. We could talk about all that, and there's plenty to discuss on that front if he wanted to go, you know, in that direction.
And of course, it was a very popular thing for a lot of conservatives to do when it came to the NBA, is that they used, you know, Daryl Morey, his tweet about Hong Kong and they use that to try to attack NBA players, NBA personnel such as yourself and LeBron James. And all of a sudden, the NBA had to stand up to big bad China. How did, aside from the president, to see so many of our lawmakers using the NBA as basically a political talking point, what were your thoughts on that?
Well, it was a little ironic because we do so much business with China across the board. I mean, there's thousands of countries or companies that do business over there. And our government has to negotiate trade agreements with them. And so, everybody has to sort of do that dance, between, all right, we've got a business deal where we're making money from China, but there are civil rights abuses going on there that we know about. And so how do you reconcile that? And those kinds of questions are never black and white. If they were black and white, we would withdraw all businesses from China and we would say, okay, we're never doing business with China again. And obviously we're not doing that across the board. It's too deeply entwined in the world economy. So this is the whole point about modern conversation. There's so much nuance and complexity in every conversation, and yet we choose to make everything good and evil, right and wrong, black and white, and we try to simplify it as if it's that simple.
Have you reached out or talked to Daryl Morey at all?
Yeah, Daryl and I spoke at that time, and he called me back then, and then I called him later on, and we had a couple of good conversations, and so I think he felt bad for unwittingly dragging me into it, and I felt bad for not initially backing him up, and so we had a couple of good conversations.
But it didn't, obviously, none of that stopped you from staying vocal. As we turn toward this election, what are your feelings about how things stand in terms of whether or not, I guess I'll just plainly say it, whether or not we have the ability to upend this fool about office? Like, how do you feel about those chances? I mean, because I'll be honest, like every day, I feel differently about it. And it's never a good feeling. I feel still as unsettled as I have in the last 4 years. I can't even believe that he's still here 4 years later. I'm like, how did we not get rid of him like already? So what are your feelings as we head into the election? How confident do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I feel pretty good about it. I mean, I think this time around, I think you'll see a much bigger turnout amongst young people, especially. I don't think that Hillary Clinton inspired a lot of Democrats to get out and vote, whereas I think ironically Donald Trump will inspire a lot of Democrats to get out and vote now. And so I think there will be a bigger turnout, and as we know, Hillary won popular vote by 3 million votes last time. And with a bigger turnout, I think the popular vote will be expanded, the popular vote margin, I should say. That's a guess, but, and then it comes down to all those swing states. And that's why so many people are doing so much work in the swing states in specific to try to make the difference where it matters.
I don't know if you did anything in 2016, but seeing the outcome, and you can certainly share if you did, but do you plan to maybe put some boots to the ground? I know LeBron has already talked about that he plans to campaign for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. What do you see your role being in this election, if you see one at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of it depends on the pandemic, but I have been doing things that I've been able to do, during the pandemic in terms of fundraisers and donating to candidates who I think will make a difference, and working with a few grassroots organizations trying to get people out to vote and be registered, and so raising awareness, that kind of thing. The NBA teams and organizations are really trying to get people to vote. We have a competition right now going with the Atlanta Hawks who can generate more new registered voters, the Hawks or the Warriors. And right now the Hawks are winning by a big margin, and I call that losing the battle but winning the war, because we don't need the votes in California. We need them in Georgia. So go Hawks.
You're rooting them on. Looking at your Twitter feed, you have certainly given a lot of time and attention when it comes to voter suppression. We all know the atrocity happening with our post office. You just mentioned Georgia, which has some of the most blatant voter suppression I think that we've ever seen. When you look at the fact that we're in 2020 and we're still on voter suppression, how does that make you feel that we can't even guarantee, fair elections in this country?
Yeah. Well, that kind of takes me back to the new Jim Crow. The book was so powerful because it sort of laid out how racism has gotten more nuanced and sophisticated as time has gone on. Whereas, a couple hundred years ago, there was actual violence at the polls. Now there's, much more subtle ways of sort of keeping people from voting. But it's still there, it's still a powerful force. And honestly, what I think the best thing that could happen for this country would be for the Republican Party to reimagine itself. And, if they were to lose this election, both at the presidential level and at the Senate level, maybe it would initiate some kind of shift. But I think we needed a solid Republican Party that would appeal to the changing demographics in this country. There are a lot of conservative people out there who are looking for a party that actually appeals to their beliefs, their thoughts. And I'm all for that, because as long as it's something that is values-based and something that is worthy of conversation, yes, let's let everybody vote, and let's have two really strong parties, and let's have real debate about how to fix our problems, and let's have intelligent people who can actually sort of have these discussions and take our country along on a good path. But right now we are the furthest thing from that. We're just as Tom Friedman writes, we're the Sunnis and the Shiites, in the Middle East. We're warring factions in our own country. We're not all Americans, kind of pulling together, and that's what we've got to somehow get to. And it's a big, complex question. How do we do that?